The castles of Europe have lived in our imaginations since ancient time, with a vision of knights, damsels, princes, and kings, decked out in royal regalia and housed behind the walls of massive castle fortresses to protect their wealth and power. In America, there were no crowns, and charming princes were at a premium. But there was a new kind of nobility made up of industrial barons and bosses and empire makers, whose power and wealth was flaunted in the castles they called home. Throughout the late 1800s, in what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age, and Edith Wharton ironically named the Age of Innocence, America exploded with industry, railroads, technology, and communications. It was a boom time that brought enormous wealth to a select few. The barons and captains of industry poured their wealth into eastern castles, the grand mansions of New York, the great estates along the Hudson, and opulence unbounded in the cottages of Newport. With the birth of the 20th century, however, the power and wealth of the country began to shift away from the East. The magical lore of America followed the sun, and our knights became cowboys, and our Camelot, the West. It is in the West that the powerful newspaper publisher, film producer, and art connoisseur William Randolph Hearst would build a magnificent castle. They told him that it couldn't be done. But William Randolph Hearst was a giant, and he seldom took no for an answer. Besides, he explained, I just love the place. The result is an incredible Mediterranean villa in a magnificent setting high up in the San Lucia Mountains of California. The main house rises like a cathedral in the center of some ancient Mediterranean town, high above a plaza filled with fountains, gardens, and art. Around and below the plaza lie three exquisite guest houses: Casa del Sol, the House of the Sun; Casa del Mar, the House of the Sea; and Casa del Monte, the House of the Mountains. Beyond the plaza lies an eloquent remembrance of the ruins of Rome and Greece. The Hearst Castle, with its 165 exquisite rooms, was set amidst more than 250,000 acres of wilderness, a parcel of land larger than the state of Rhode Island. The rich, famous, and powerful from all over the world would come here to play, be seen, and revel in the beauty of art and nature. It was truly a magical place. When we return, a look inside William Randolph Hearst's magnificent San Simeon. America was born right in the middle of the Civil War in 1863, the only child of George and Phoebe Hearst. George Hearst had little formal schooling, but did learn geology and mining on his own. In the mid-1800s, when George headed to California in search of gold, he hit silver in the Comstock lode in Nevada, and copper in the Anaconda mine in Montana, a mine that ended up producing 1/5 of the world's copper. After building a fortune in mining and real estate, George then got into politics, winning a Senate seat from California. In contrast, his wife Phoebe was as refined and delicate as George was rich and crude, a match made somewhere in heaven. And their son William Randolph got the best of both. A love of art, beauty, and sophistication from his mother. A love of the outdoors, ambition, politics, and humor from his father. Hearst's entry into California real estate was through his father's purchase of the 48,000-acre Piedra Blanca Ranch in 1865. The senior Hearst constructed an 18-room house on the property in 1870. Modest by San Simeon standards, it's nevertheless believed to be one of the finest examples of California colonial architecture remaining today.
Well, it's my understanding that for a good many years after the purchase of the ranch, William Randolph, his mother, his father, friends, etc., enjoying the ranch, decided to picnic somewhere on the ranch that gave them outstanding vistas and good weather and so forth. So they picked out what became known as the Enchanted Hill. I think there were many picnic festivities held up there, et cetera, and it became a place on this ranch that was, I think, very dear to the hearts of William Randolph, his mother, his father, his friends. And so I think ultimately it was decided that that should be a site that was developed for a very significant purpose.
As a young man, Hearst went on to Harvard, where his most memorable achievement was as business manager for the notoriously satiric Harvard Lampoon. Hearst turned the money-losing laugh rag into a money maker, flashing the skills upon which he would later build a media empire. Yet fun seemed to be his priority, as evidenced by his performances with the Hasty Pudding Club. The Harvard dean, however, was less than impressed with the young fun lover and asked him not to return. At age 23, Hearst's interest in journalism was reignited when his father gave him a small newspaper to run. It was the San Francisco Examiner, and run it he would. Indeed, he would revolutionize the entire newspaper industry with bold innovation, both technically and editorially. Hearst was a populist, a showman, using the finest illustrators, writers, and columnists that he could find, adding entertainment to information. Among the writers he hired were Mark Twain, Rudyard Kipling, and even Jack London. He started the very first comic strip and called it the Katzenjammer Kids. And from the Examiner, Hearst began building his own empire that at its height would include 98 businesses and 38,000 employees. A motion picture company that produced newsreels and some 100 theatrical films, magazines like Good Housekeeping, radio, and eventually television. And he fell in love with a beautiful young stage actress. On their first date, he was more guide than Don Juan, as he gave her the tour of his newspaper operation at the New York Journal. On the eve of his 40th birthday, he married the beautiful 22-year-old Millicent Wilson. They would have 5 sons who grew up in an extraordinary environment of art, Hollywood, and politics. Following his father's love of politics, Hearst twice won seats to Congress, lost races for mayor and governor of New York, and couldn't quite get enough support for his presidential hopes. But even without politics, Hearst's far-flung enterprises kept him on the move. He could live where he wanted, but all the while, Hearst never forgot the enchanted hill of his childhood. So in 1919, he hired a 5'1", 100-pound, tireless and brilliant architect named Julia Morgan to build what he first called a camp at San Simeon. The remarkable partnership of Hearst and Morgan would create a masterpiece in the middle of nowhere. Hearst was in love with Mediterranean art and architecture, and he and Julia Morgan would create a grand Renaissance villa, combining Spanish Moorish and Italian designs. Throughout the project, Hearst maintained extensive personal involvement. His opinions flowed freely in frequent letters to Morgan, this one on the virtues of weatherproofing. Let's have comfort and health before so much art. The art won't do us any good if we're all dead with pneumonia. At a time when women were not in the professions, Julia Morgan became known as one of the best architects in America. As a woman, she was a pioneer. As a designer, she was one of the best, with a legacy of some 700 buildings. Julia was not only the architect, but the construction boss as well, hiring and firing workers, purchasing supplies and artifacts, contracting with shippers. For nearly 30 years, she and Hearst would work together on what they always called simply the ranch. It was a monumental effort. The Enchanted Hill was truly in the middle of nowhere. Roads had to be built. Craftsmen brought in with materials, supplies, equipment, along with food, housing, and water for the workers. The building of San Simeon was a logistical nightmare, an engineering miracle, and a magical artistic achievement. It was the biggest private construction project in all of California. A pier was built and supplies brought in by tramp steamers and driven to the top of the mountain on unpaved roads in chain-driven trucks.
When Hearst Castle was begun in 1919, it was a very isolated place. It's still quite remote, but then there were no roads. There was no Highway 01 along the coast of California, and to get here was quite a trek. They were able to bring in building materials because of the harbor at San Simeon. It's one of the few safe harbors along the coast of California and one of the few anywhere near us. And there was a coastal steamer that serviced the central coast of California at that time. It brought in materials, it took out materials for trade from the local ranches, and Hearst was able to bring in the building materials and the antiques in those early years by coastal steamer.
The Great House would look like stone, but it was in fact poured concrete with steel reinforcement. Both Hearst and Morgan had survived the Great San Francisco earthquake and wanted the strongest construction material possible. Julia Morgan was involved in all parts of the design, interior and exterior. She personally oversaw the design of the tiles and entrances, ceilings and fountains. When she learned a shipment of exotic teak wood was available, she bought it and had a San Francisco artist create the exquisite carvings she put beneath the eaves of La Casa Grande. On site, craftsmen created a stunning array of stonework and woodwork, while the molding shop cranked out a ton of decorative stone lions. And real lions. Hearst had one of the largest private collections of animals in the world. Zebras, elephants, ostrich, yak, elk, moose, fallow deer, llamas, giraffes, and even anteaters roamed the grounds. Lions, tigers, and bears were kept in a secure zoo area. Hearst loved animals. He even had the cooks throw food scraps out for the resident mice. There were also 10,000 beef cattle, vegetable gardens, poultry farms, and dairy barns to feed the guests and workers. In addition, they also had to feed the animals and haul in everything from feed for the ostriches to horse meat for the lions and fish for the polar bears. Great art and artifacts were also brought in from across Europe, and one by one began to fill warehouses and then move on to the Great Castle. But Hearst did not want a museum. He wanted life and art to mingle as one. Tons of rich topsoil, enough to cover 50 acres 5 feet deep, were hauled up the mountain to create fertile beds for Hearst's lush gardens and terraces. Julia Morgan not only designed the gardens, but 5 nurseries to supply 700,000 annuals a year to create a radiant and ever-changing landscape.